Okay, so get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into a question that's been bugging humanity since we first, looked up at the stars and wondered, what is reality, really?
Ah, philosophy. You want to go back to the very beginning, those first attempts to understand the universe
Mm.
without resorting to myths and legends.
Exactly. We're talking ancient Greece, those first philosophers who ditched the supernatural and said, let's figure this out with reason and observation. They were searching for the arch, that one fundamental element that everything comes from, like
Yeah.
cracking the universe's code, right?
Absolutely. And boy, did they have theories. Take Thales, for example. He landed on water as the arch, saw how water changes, ice, steam, and thought, that's got to be the basic building block.
It's a pretty compelling idea when you consider just how important water is to life, right? Then there's Anaximenes, arguing for air, believing its ability to become denser, to condense, held the key. But then, whoa, Anaximander comes along with something else entirely.
Ah, yes. Anaximander and the Apeiron. This boundless, unknowable something or other that everything emerges from. Tough one to wrap your head around, but it shows you how ambitious these early thinkers were. Not afraid to tackle the biggest questions.
Takes guts to look at the universe and say, I bet it all boils down to this one thing. But it wasn't just about the physical world. We also see ideas about mathematics, cosmic harmony, popping up with Pythagoras.
Pythagoras, yeah, famous for his theorem, but he also believed that numbers held the secrets to the universe, saw a kind of mathematical order in everything, a beautiful symphony of ratios governing the cosmos, what he called the music of the spheres.
So he imagined planets and stars like moving to the celestial music. That's thinking big. But not everyone was sold on this static, harmonious universe. Cue Heraclitus, who famously said, everything flows.
Heraclitus, he believed change was the fundamental principle, driven by logos, a principle of order. Imagine a fire, needs fuel to burn, constantly transforming wood into ash. That was the universe for him, a constant dance of opposing forces, always in motion.
Powerful image. And one that still resonates, right? I mean, think about how much change defines our own lives. But it wasn't all grand theories of the cosmos. These early philosophers also loved to dig into those logical paradoxes that make you question, well, reality itself.
And nobody did that better than Zeno, with his mind-bending paradoxes. He'd present these arguments, perfectly logical, but they'd lead to impossible conclusions, like the idea that motion is impossible.
Wait, hold on. How can motion be impossible? We see it all the time.
Exactly. That's the whole point of a paradox. One of his most famous ones is the idea that to cross any distance, you first have to cover half of it, then half of what's left, and so on, forever. You never actually reach your destination because there's always another half to go.
Feels like a mathematical trick, but it makes you think, right? About the nature of space, of time. Can our senses even be trusted? It's that feeling you get when you look at the night sky and realize just how much you don't know.
Exactly. And those questions about knowledge, about reality, well, they were taken up by two of the biggest names in philosophy, Plato and his student, Aristotle.
Talk about a philosophical power couple. Let's start with Plato and his mind-blowing theory of forms. He suggested that everything we see in this world, there's a perfect, unchanging blueprint for it, existing in a separate realm.
Like there's an ideal chair out there, the concept of chairness. And every chair we see in this world is just an imperfect copy, a reflection of that perfect form.
So we're surrounded by, like, shadows of true reality. How do we access this realm of perfect forms?
Plato believed we do it through reason. He used the allegory of the cave to explain this. Imagine prisoners trapped in a cave. The only reality they know are shadows projected on the wall. One prisoner escapes, sees the outside world, and realizes those shadows were just cheap imitations of real things.
So the escapee, that's like the philosopher, right? Using reason to break free from the limitations of our senses, seeing the true forms. What a powerful metaphor for the power of knowledge.
Exactly. But not everyone bought into Plato's two-tiered reality. Aristotle, his star pupil, he went in a different direction. He figured true knowledge comes from studying the physical world, not some otherworldly realm.
So instead of searching for the perfect chair in some abstract realm, we should study real chairs, their materials, their function, what makes them chairs.
Yes, observation and experience, that was the foundation of knowledge for Aristotle. He believed the essence of something, its whatness, is found in what you can observe. And this connects to his idea of telos, the purpose of a thing.
The purpose of a chair is to be sat on. The purpose of a plant is to grow. And the purpose of this deep dive, well, that's to understand how these incredible ideas shaped Western thought.
Precisely. And Aristotle gave us a cool framework for understanding how things come to be with his four causes. Material, what it's made of. Formal, its design. Efficient, what brought it about. And final, its purpose.
So the material cause of a house is wood, brick, formal cause, the blueprint, efficient cause, the builders, final cause to provide shelter, a home.
Exactly. It's a way to break down complex stuff, understand those underlying principles. But the story of philosophy, it doesn't end with the Greeks. We move into the medieval period, and the big debate becomes the relationship between faith and reason.
That's where things get really interesting, trying to reconcile these ancient philosophical ideas with the emerging religious doctrines of the time.
Absolutely. And this tension plays out in the work of thinkers like Al-Ghazali, this influential Islamic scholar. He actually questioned the whole idea of cause and effect.
Wait, he questioned cause and effect, but that's like a basic principle of, well, everything.
Right. But Al-Ghazali, he was arguing that God's will was the ultimate cause behind everything. It's not the fire that causes cotton to burn. It's God willing it to burn.
Now, that is a radical idea, especially for that time. Really makes you realize how deeply intertwined philosophy and religion were. And speaking of mind-bending ideas, we've got to talk about Ibn Sina and his wild thought experiment.
Yes. Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, he presented this scenario that still gets philosophers going today. Imagine yourself just suspended in midair, completely deprived of all your senses. No sight, sound, touch, nothing.
Okay, trying to picture that. It's like sensory deprivation on steroids.
Exactly. And Ibn Sina proposes that in this state, you might doubt your body exists, right? Because you can't sense it. But you can't doubt the existence of your mind because you're still there thinking, experiencing the thought experiment.
So even without a body, our minds would still exist. Whoa. That raises some serious questions about consciousness, the self. It's like he's setting the stage for later philosophers like Descartes, who is also obsessed with this mind-body problem.
Exactly. Ibn Sina, way ahead of his time. His ideas had a huge impact. But speaking of influential figures, we can't forget about Anselm and his attempt to logically prove the existence of God.
Ah, yes. Anselm's ontological argument. A classic of philosophical reasoning. It's a little complicated, but basically he argues that God, by definition, is the greatest being imaginable, right?
Right. And then he goes on to say that it's greater to exist in reality than just in the mind. So if God only existed in our minds, he wouldn't be the greatest being conceivable. Therefore, God must exist in reality too.
Wow, that's some next-level logic there. Amazing to think that these ideas, these debates from centuries ago, are still relevant, still shaping philosophical thought today.
They really are. And as we move into the Renaissance, the rise of modern philosophy, we'll see how these seeds of thought blossom into even more complex, challenging ideas.
I, for one, am ready to see where this philosophical journey takes us. But for now, let's appreciate these early thinkers, their audacity to ask the big questions, laying the groundwork for the grand tradition of Western philosophy.
Last time, remember, we were talking about those medieval thinkers wrestling with faith and reason, trying to square philosophical ideas with religious doctrine.
Right, and as we hit the Renaissance, the 17th century, the whole philosophical landscape shifts, like someone opened a window and let in all this fresh air.
It was a wild time for ideas, and leading the charge was René Descartes. Scientist, mathematician, but more than anything, he wanted certainty in a world that felt, well, pretty uncertain.
And he really went all in on that, decided to doubt everything, even his own senses, just to see if there was anything he could know for sure. Talk about a clean slate.
He even imagined this evil demon, a trickster, messing with him, making him think the world, his memories, even his own body, were real when they might not be.
That deceiving demon, it makes you wonder, what if is real? Still a question philosophers grapple with today. But even with all that doubt, Descartes found one unshakable truth.
Exactly. Even if he was being tricked about everything else, the very act of doubting, of thinking, proved he existed. Hence the famous line, "I think, therefore I am."
Cogito, ergo sum. More than just a cool Latin phrase, it's a declaration of the power of the mind. But this led Descartes to another big idea: substance dualism.
Right. Descartes believed there were two fundamental substances: mind, which was non-physical, and body, physical. And this idea, it had a huge impact, shapes how we see the mind-body connection even now.
And still sparks debate, right? If mind and body are separate, how do they interact? How does a thought become a physical action? Descartes thought it happened in the pineal gland, but even he couldn't quite explain it.
A question that keeps philosophers and scientists up at night. But this quest for certainty, it also fed into a major debate of the time: rationalism versus empiricism.
Okay, let's break it down. Rationalism, empiricism, what's the difference?
So the rationalists, folks like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, they believed reason was the primary source of knowledge. Innate ideas, truths we're born with, like math, logic, it's like we come preloaded with certain understandings.
So it's not just experiencing the world, but using our minds to unlock truths that are already there, inside us.
Precisely. But then you have the empiricists. John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume. They were all about sensory experience as the source of knowledge. We're born blank slates. Our minds are filled by what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell.
It's like nature versus nurture, but for knowledge. Empiricists, they're all about learning through experience, observation, interaction.
Exactly. And it led to some wild conclusions. Take John Locke. He said because knowledge comes from experience, there's no such thing as innate ideas.
Wait, so we're not born with any knowledge at all. Everything is learned.
That was Locke's big claim. Our minds, they're empty containers waiting to be filled by the world around us.
Interesting idea, but doesn't it kind of downplay the role of our own minds in shaping what we know? And speaking of questioning assumptions, we can't forget David Hume, the skeptic extraordinaire, threw a real wrench in the works.
Ah, Hume. He stirred things up with his skepticism, especially his critique of causality. Hume said we don't observe cause and effect, only a sequence of events.
Not sure I follow. Got an example?
Okay, picture a billiard ball hitting another, making it move. We assume the first ball caused the second to move. But Hume said, all we see is one event, then another. We don't see some invisible force connecting them.
So we just assume cause and effect based on seeing similar things happen before.
Exactly. Hume argued it's custom, habit, that makes us believe in causality, not actual observation. And this was huge, not just for philosophy, but for science too.
Right, because science relies on observing cause and effect, making predictions. If Hume is right, if we can't be sure about causality, what does that mean for scientific knowledge?
It was a bombshell. And it was a challenge taken up by Immanuel Kant, one of the giants of philosophy.
Kant, another heavy hitter. How did he try to bring these conflicting views together, rationalism and empiricism?
Kant wanted to build a bridge. He saw the value in both reason and experience. He said, sure, we gain knowledge through senses, like the empiricists said, but our minds aren't just passively absorbing information. We have these built-in structures of understanding that shape how we see the world.
So it's not just about the raw data from our senses, but how our minds organize that data, make sense of it.
Exactly. Kant believed in these categories of understanding, things like space, time, causality, that are hardwired into our minds. They're like filters, shaping the information from our senses into the world we experience.
So we're not just seeing the world as is, but constructing our own reality based on how our minds work.
That was Kant's radical idea. He called it transcendental idealism. It's complicated, but basically, he's saying the world we experience isn't the same as the world in itself. We can never truly know that thing in itself, only our experience of it, which is shaped by our minds.
Like looking through glasses, we can't take them off to see directly, only through the lenses. Makes you realize how much of our reality is our minds, not just what's out there.
It's a mind-blowing idea. And it had a huge impact, influencing everything from epistemology to metaphysics to aesthetics. And it sets the stage for even more radical, challenging ideas in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Well, I am ready to dive into those ideas, but for now, let's take a second to appreciate this shift we've been talking about. Doubt becomes a philosophical tool. The debate between reason and experience heats up, and the idea emerges that our minds are actively shaping reality. Amazing how these thinkers challenged us assumptions, expanded the boundaries of what we thought we knew. And we're back, ready for the final stretch of our philosophical journey. We've been through some big ideas, but the 19th and 20th centuries, well, they bring a whole new set of questions to the table.
It's true. This is where things get even more interesting. Thinkers start wrestling with the idea that language itself, the words we use, plays a huge role in how we understand, well, everything.
So it's not just about what's actually out there in the world, but how our words, our language, shape our perception of it.
Exactly. It's called the linguistic turn. Language takes center stage. Thinkers like Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, they argued that understanding language was the key to unlocking some of the biggest philosophical mysteries.
It's like realizing the tool we use to understand the world might actually be influencing the very thing we're trying to understand. Fascinating. Tell me more about this Frege fellow. What were his big ideas?
Frege, he was all about logic and language. And he pointed out this crucial difference between the sense of a word and its reference.
Okay, need an example for that one. Sounds a bit abstract.
Sure. Imagine the phrases, the evening star and the morning star. What do they both refer to?
Venus, right, depending on when you see it.
Exactly. Same object, Venus. But those phrases, they have different senses, different meanings, depending on the context. Friedge said this distinction was key to clear thinking, avoiding philosophical confusion.
So one thing, multiple ways to describe it, and those descriptions can change how we think about it.
Precisely. And this whole idea of language shaping, meaning, well, it was taken even further by Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. He said language isn't just about creating a picture of the world. It's about using words in different ways, like playing different language games depending on the situation.
Language games. I like that. What do you mean?
Think about how you use language differently in different situations. Talking to a friend versus, say, talking to a judge in a courtroom. Totally different, right?
Totally different rules, for sure.
Exactly. Wittgenstein would say each situation is like a different language game, with its own rules, goals, meanings. And lots of philosophical problems, he thought, came from misunderstandings about these language games.
So we're all playing different games with language, and sometimes those games get mixed up, leading to confusion. Is that what he's saying?
Exactly. Understanding these different games, it's key to communication, to solving those philosophical puzzles that have been around for ages. But of course, the 20th century had even more up its sleeve. This is also when existentialism takes off.
Existentialism. I've heard the word, but what's it all about?
At its core, existentialism is all about these big questions. What does it mean to exist? What is the meaning of life? How do we deal with freedom and responsibility when the universe doesn't seem to care? Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, they were all about individual freedom, responsibility, even in a world that can feel meaningless or even absurd.
Sounds a bit, I don't know, depressing.
Well, it can be.
Yeah.
Sartre had this famous line, "Man is condemned to be free," meaning we have the burden of making choices, defining our lives, with no instructions, no predetermined purpose.
Talk about pressure. Just
What?
thrown into existence, figure it out as you go.
That's the existentialist view. But it's not always negative. Many found it liberating, this idea that we create our own meaning, our own values.
So it's about embracing that freedom, that responsibility, even when things feel uncertain.
Exactly. And this emphasis on individual experience, finding meaning in an often absurd world, it had a huge impact on art, literature, culture. But existentialism wasn't the only movement tackling power and meaning. There was also critical theory.
Right, critical theory. What was their deal?
Critical theory, it's a broad field, but it comes out of Marxism. It's all about analyzing and critiquing power structures. Thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, they looked at how things like capitalism, media, technology shape our thoughts, beliefs, even our desires.
So they were interested in how these huge social forces affect our individual lives, often without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And they were worried about how these forces could limit freedom, silence dissenting voices, maintain power imbalances.
It's like those philosophical watchdogs we talked about, but instead of looking for logical fallacies, they were on the lookout for oppression, control.
Exactly. And critical theory is still relevant today. It helps us understand inequality, challenge those dominant narratives, and fight for social justice.
Wow, we really have covered a lot of ground. From those ancient Greeks searching for the basic building blocks of the universe, to 20th century thinkers grappling with language, social structures, it's clear philosophy is anything but boring.
It's a conversation that never ends, constantly changing, evolving, and it shapes how we understand ourselves, our world.
And that's why it's so fascinating. It's not about having all the answers, but asking the right questions, challenging what we think we know, embracing the complexity of it all.
So as you go out and explore these ideas further, stay curious, keep asking questions, never stop seeking wisdom.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Western philosophy. We'll be back with more big ideas to explore soon.